Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is right around the corner, and I'm really looking forward to it, both because I've really enjoyed the job that Paul Rudd has done with the character, plus I'm super excited to see the story of Kang really starting to develop in the MCU. And so I thought I'd put together another Character Keys video on Ant-Man where I talk about 5 different books at 5 different price levels, so that if you also enjoy this character, then you can find a book to add to your collection no matter what your budget. So let's get started. So if I had $5, I'd be looking to pick up a copy of Irredeemable Ant-Man #1, which is the first appearance of the third Ant-Man, Eric O'Grady. And I think this is a cool book to pick up as a collector because the Eric O'Grady story is just a really fascinating one. If you don't know much about his character, he was originally like this low-level SHIELD agent who came upon the Ant-Man costume at work, and so he actually stole it, but not for very noble reasons, but because he thought, oh man, if I had these powers from this suit, then I can get some women, and I can end up torturing my enemies and getting some revenge on the people who've picked on me. And so he started off with this really kind of villainous role as Ant-Man. But despite that, he ended up joining the Thunderbolts, which of course is a team of kind of villainous people, and then the Avengers. But his story arc ends with him becoming more and more noble over time, and ultimately ends with him sacrificing his life for a child. And so I think he's just a super interesting character that's really fun and presents a lot of good moral questions. And so if you enjoy that kind of story, then I think this is a book that you might want to pick up. But I think it's also a good book to buy as a speculator because, of course, the MCU is starting to introduce some second and third generation legacy heroes. Of course, in just the most recent MCU movie, Wakanda Forever, you have Shuri becoming the new Black Panther. You have Ironheart basically becoming the new Iron Man. And so eventually, the MCU may be looking for a new Ant-Man, especially as Paul Rudd begins to age. And so who knows? Maybe they bring Eric O'Grady into the picture. And of course, if they do, then this book will skyrocket. And so I think it's a really neat one to pick up. All right, well, if I had $15, I'd be looking to pick up a copy of Avengers #223, which contains this classic Ant-Man cover where Hawkeye is basically using Ant-Man as an arrow. And I think it's just a must-have book for any Ant-Man fan because, in my opinion, it's the coolest Ant-Man cover there is. It's just so much fun, so entertaining. So I think it's a book that's great to pick up. All right, if I had $40, I'd be looking to pick up a copy of Avengers #181, which is the first appearance of Scott Lang, but this is actually before he becomes Ant-Man. And so if you don't know his story, he was a thief at one point and then he was imprisoned. But while he was in prison, he started to kind of reform his life and also developed his electronic skills even more. And so when he gets out, Tony Stark hires him to set up the security system at Avengers Mansion. He knows, hey, if Scott Lang can set up this system, then it's going to be pretty foolproof. And so this is what happens in this issue. And I think it's a very under the radar issue because people often gravitate towards his first appearance as Ant-Man as his most important key. But this is the first appearance that Scott Lang shows up, and I think it's a really undervalued book and one you might want to add to your collection. All right, if I had $150, I'd be looking to pick up a nice copy of Marvel Premiere #47, which is when Scott Lang does become the Ant-Man for the first time. And so what happens in this story is that his daughter Cassie ends up getting sick, and the only doctor that can really help her, Dr. Sondheim, ends up being kidnapped by Darren Cross. And so even though Scott Lang has reformed his life, he ends up stealing the Ant-Man armor so that he can rescue Dr. Sondheim, so of course that she can cure his daughter. And so he ends up doing that, and then he approaches Hank Pym with the armor, admits that he stole it, but instead of having Scott Lang arrested, Pym realizes, hey, well, you really did this actually for a noble reason, and so why don't you take this armor and you become the new Ant-Man? Because, of course, if you know anything about Dr. Pym's history, he's moved on from being Ant-Man to Giant Man, Goliath, and eventually Yellow Jacket. And so in this book, he gives the Ant-Man armor to Scott Lang. And this book is also cool because not only does it contain the first appearance of Scott Lang as Ant-Man, but it also contains the first appearance of his daughter, Cassie Lang, who ends up becoming Stature and then the superhero Stinger. And of course, we are getting that hero in this new Ant-Man movie. Even though Cassie has been introduced earlier, she becomes a hero that joins Ant-Man and Wasp in the upcoming movie. And this book also contains the first appearance of Darren Cross, who ends up becoming the evil Yellow Jacket, who was the villain in the first Ant-Man movie. And so, you know me, I love comics that have multiple keys involved, because if you're an Ant-Man fan, or you're a Cassie Lang fan, or you're a Yellow Jacket fan, or you just want first appearances. Of course, this is also the first cover appearance of Scott Lang as Ant-Man. Man, so many great things are happening with this book, and an incredible one to add to your collection. All right, well, that brings us to the Grail, which is Tales to Astonish number 27, which is the first appearance of the original Ant-Man, Hank Pym. And I think Hank Pym is one of the most underrated Marvel characters there is. He is such a fascinating character, much like Eric O'Grady, because he's gone through so many different personas and has had different mental health crises over time that ultimately ended up with him assaulting his wife, Janet Van Dyne, who is the Wasp. He's the creator of Ultron in the comics. And of course, Ultron has a different story in the movies, but in the comics, it's Hank Pym that creates him. And so he's just a super important, super interesting character. And so this is an awesome book to pick up. Now, if you've seen my character keys videos, you know I often like to show off one of these keys that I recently picked up. And I'm going to do that in just a minute. But first, I wanted to share 5 bonus keys. So bonus key number 1 is the 3rd volume of Avengers, number 62. And this is when Scott Lang joins the Avengers. So if you're especially a fan of the Scott Lang version of Ant-Man, then I think this is a neat book that you can get for only $5. All right, bonus book number 2 is another one that you can pick up for $5. And this is Secret Avengers number 32, which is the first appearance of the Black Ant. So as you might remember, I mentioned a few minutes ago that Eric O'Grady ended up sacrificing himself to save a child. And he did this in a battle with a group called the Descendants, which is basically a group of androids. Well, they killed him, but then they actually replaced him with another android that looked just like him, and this android ends up infiltrating the Avengers. And so that makes for a very interesting story. It's kind of like the Secret Invasion with Skrulls, but instead it's a robot or an android that's infiltrated the Avengers. And so this is the book where you find out that, oh shoot, this guy is not just Scott Lang, it's actually a life model decoy. And so a really fun story that I remember reading off the rack. All right, where bonus key number 3 is another one that you can pick up for just $5. And this is Uncanny Avengers number 4. And in this book, Hank Pym actually merges with Ultron. And so this sets up a lot of interesting stories and asks a lot of philosophical questions about what does it mean to be a man versus a machine. And really that's part of the whole Hank Pym Ultron dynamic that goes throughout their stories, because Ultron views Pym as his father, and Pym views Ultron in some sense as his son, and he takes on a lot of responsibility for him and feels guilty about what Ultron becomes. And of course, this is also kind of a Frankenstein type story. And so really interesting and fascinating. Once again, I think Hank Pym is one of the most underrated characters in all of Marvel Comics. And so this is another cool book to own. All right, well, bonus key number 4 can be had for about $10. And this is Avengers number 213. And this is the book where Hank Pym does end up assaulting his wife. And it's one of the most important stories in all of comics. And I would have put this in the original 5 books that I mentioned, but Pym does this while he's the Yellow Jacket character, so it's technically not an Ant-Man story. So I didn't feel like I could include it in the first 5, but it's just such an important book that I put it in these bonus 5, even though it's technically a Yellow Jacket story. But it's just a super important story. In comics, I think it's probably the first time in a mainstream comic, at least, where you have a hero that assaults his wife, and obviously it brings up a lot of ethical questions about that, and later on about mental health, and it leads into stories about being bipolar and things like that. So just a super important book, and one that any Avengers fan, any Marvel fan, and certainly any Hank Pym fan should put in their collection. All right, and so bonus book number 5 is Marvel Premiere number 48, which is the second appearance of Scott Lang as Ant-Man and the second appearance of Cassie Lang, who, as I mentioned earlier, goes on to become Stinger, who is going to be in this upcoming movie. And so, as I've talked about before, once you are priced out of first appearances, or maybe even just already have the first appearance in your collection, second appearances of characters are really cool ones to add to your collection. All right, so now I get to reveal which of those keys that I've recently added to my collection, and it is this one, Marvel Premiere number 47, which is a book that I mentioned I love because it contains the first appearance of Scott Lang as Ant-Man, of course the first appearance of him as Ant-Man, but not only that, also the first appearance of Cassie Lang and the first appearance of Darren Cross. So a book with multiple keys, love it to add to my collection. It's one I've been looking for. Wasn't sure if I was going to be able to find it at a good price anytime soon because of the hype around Quantumania, but thankfully I did. And this is a pretty clean copy. I'm planning to send it off to CGC. It has a couple of small spine ticks, and the biggest thing is some blunting here at the bottom corner. I think it can get at least a 9.0, I hope at least. And maybe, if I get the right grade on a right day, a 9.2 and possibly a 9.4. But regardless, love this book. Happy to add it to my collection. Of course, one day I would love to get my hands on a copy of Astonishing Tales number 27 because I do love Hank Pym, and of course that's the Grail. But in the meantime, I'm really happy with this book. And not only did I get that one from this seller, but I had a few others that I wanted to show to you. These next two were actually books I mentioned in my last Character Keys video on Man-Thing. So you know they are ones that I'm excited about since I've already talked about liking them as books. We have Astonishing Tales number 12, which is the second appearance of Man-Thing. As I mentioned, if you can't afford the first appearance or already have the first appearance, these second appearances are cool to pick up. But it's also a book that's a double key. Another good reason to pick it up because it contains the first cover appearance of Bobby Morse, who of course goes on to become Mockingbird. And then the book that I'm probably most excited about, other than the Marvel premiere, of course, is Astonishing Tales number 13, which is the first cover appearance of Man-Thing. And so I love collecting first cover appearances. So super happy to get this one. Speaking of first appearances and the first cover appearances, I also got The Defenders number 4, which is the first appearance of Valkyrie. And another book I got, this is not a first appearance, but this is just an awesome cover. As a Galactus fan especially, and a Jack Kirby fan, we have Fantastic Four number 173, which again has this awesome cover, and that's the reason I bought it. And two more books, we have Supernatural Thrillers number 2, which is the first appearance of the Invisible Man. I always love getting my horror first appearances. And finally, Power Man and Iron Fist number 58, which contains the first appearance of Ella Gila, who was in the recent She-Hulk TV show. So there you have it. Hope I introduced you to some keys that you might consider adding to your collection if you're an Ant-Man fan, or at least dropped a little bit of knowledge of that character on you. Hope you enjoyed seeing the recent books that I picked up. Of course, thanks so much for watching. And if you haven't subscribed, I'd ask if you'd consider doing so as we get closer and closer to 500 subscribers when I'm going to do my next giveaway. And I was hoping to have the books that I'm going to give away ready to show you today, but the USPS has foiled me once again, and they're being held up in customs. And maybe it's not the USPS's fault, but still the U.S. government somehow not getting these books across the Canadian border to me. But eventually I will have them, be able to show them to you. But in the meantime, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel so we can give those books away quickly once they get here. Like the video, comment. Tell me what you think about Ant-Man. Which of the three are your favorite, or what's an Ant-Man book that you would like to pick up, or just some thoughts you have about the upcoming Quantumania movie. I'd love to hear those thoughts, and of course, it will help with the algorithm and this channel. So thanks again, and I look forward to the next one.